All right, folks, welcome back to Blood Vessels. This particular section is about peripheral resistance, blood pressure, and peripheral resistance. So this table gives you some formulas, and let me tell you a couple of the important things here. Well, one of the important things here is that flow is proportional to pressure. That should make sense. If you increase the pressure, you're going to increase flow. And I think that's pretty intuitive. And if you decrease pressure, you decrease flow. And likewise, if you decrease flow, then you're going to decrease the pressure downstream. And if you increase flow, then you're going to increase the pressure downstream. And you could just think of your garden hose and think of that. I mean, there's no pressure in your hose until you turn the water on. That would be zero flow, zero pressure. Then you turn the water on, there's pressure in your hose. And then if you were to put your thumb over the end of the hose, the water comes out under higher pressure. Well, actually, I'm getting off on a tangent. That's the next part I'm going to talk about. So flow and pressure is proportional. Increase flow, increase pressure. Decrease flow, decrease pressure, and vice versa. Increase pressure, increase flow. Decrease pressure, decrease flow. All right, now resistance. Flow is inversely proportional to resistance. That's why it says flow is proportional to 1 over R. That means that if you increase resistance, you decrease flow. Because if you have 1 over, say, 5, if flow equals 1 over 5, and so the resistance is 5, that's flow equals 1/5. But if you increase the resistance, and now it's 1 over 10, well, now flow is 0.1. It was 0.2. Now it's 0.1. It went down. Flow just went down. But you increased resistance. So flow and resistance is inversely proportional. And the resistance is controlled in your body by vasoconstricting or vasodilating your arterioles. That's where resistance is controlled. So if you vasoconstrict your arterioles, then you've just decreased flow because you've increased resistance. And if you vasodilate your arterioles, then you've increased flow because you've decreased your resistance. And by putting those two together, if you have flow is proportional to pressure and flow is inversely proportional to resistance, you simply put them together and you say flow is proportional to pressure divided by resistance. So really this formula right there is the combination of these two. That's what it is. All right, now this formula right here is important, although the radius raised to the 4th power is not that important. That's a physical phenomenon, but I don't need you to memorize r to the 4th power. But here's what I do need you to remember. The radius does affect the resistance. The higher the radius, the lower the resistance. That means a real small blood vessel like this has high resistance, but a huge blood vessel like this has low resistance. And the exact proportion is 1 over r to the 4th. So as r to the 4th goes up, my resistance goes down. And let me just say it for you like this. If my resistance was 1/2, that means R is 2 millimeters. Let's say it's 2 millimeters. If my resistance is 1/2, and my radius of my lumen goes up, and it goes up by 2 to the 4th, say. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. It goes to 1 over 16. I've just increased my radius to 16. That's a huge blood vessel now. Look what happened to my resistance. It got very, very tiny. It's not 0.5 anymore. It's 1 over 16. So that resistance is inversely proportional to the radius of the lumen is important. Okay, so those are the important ones to look at here. This is showing you, this is a little bit of physics here. There's a little bit of Laplace's law in here. I won't test you on Laplace's law at all, but if you're already taking physics, you might be familiar with some of that. And what it's showing you here is, first of all, resistance has everything to do with the length of the blood vessel, and that has to do with friction of the blood encountering the edges of the blood vessel. The longer the blood vessel, the more friction the blood encounters, and therefore the more resistance. And that just has to do with length of the blood vessel. So there's more resistance between your heart and your big toe than there is between your heart and your lungs. And I think that's pretty intuitive for you. That the longer the blood vessel is, the greater the resistance to flow. And then if you look inside a blood vessel, the resistance is greatest on the edges. And in the center, where we have what we call laminar flow, and it's laminar because just think of stacked blood vessels. The blood vessels are flowing side by side and parallel, and they're not. There's no resistance between them. They're laminar means layers. So we have layered flow or laminar flow. And the only time you encounter resistance is on the edges. That's where all the resistance is. So the flow is greatest in the center of your blood vessel, where you're not encountering any resistance. And there's drag on the edges of the blood vessels where you encounter resistance. So that's laminar flow. Now, having said that this is laminar flow, so we're talking about laminar flow right here. What's the opposite of laminar flow? Or I don't know if opposite's the right term, but I guess I'll say opposite. The answer is turbulent flow. Turbulent flow you encounter when you have bifurcations in your blood vessels, so where the common iliac becomes the internal iliac and the external iliac, where the descending aorta becomes the right and left common iliacs. You have turbulent flow wherever there's bifurcation. And more importantly, more importantly, because of a disease state, you have turbulent flow where you have atheromas. I just circled these two atheromas, these two plaques. This generates turbulent flow where there normally wouldn't be. Well, what's the big deal about having turbulent flow in this area? Platelets are more likely to stick. So why are these atheromas or plaques so dangerous if they're not occluding the artery completely? Well, because platelets are more likely to stick here and start creating a clot. So I have platelets sticking, and platelets call other platelets, and pretty soon fibrin forms, and now you start making a clot on this plaque. And that hastens the occlusion of this artery. So this turbulent flow area, we always have to be careful of turbulent flow. And in fact, when a surgical procedure is done that will create turbulent flow, like putting a stent in, we typically give anticoagulant drugs or antiplatelet drugs sometimes. So like say aspirin. Aspirin's an antiplatelet drug. And you do that because we know we're generating turbulent flow with this stent we just placed. So we want to make sure platelets don't stick and exacerbate the problem. So that's laminar flow versus turbulent flow and pressure and resistance relationships. This is showing you the y-axis is diameter of the blood vessel diameter, and this is showing you the different types of blood vessels right here. And you can see that with the big elastic arteries, your vessel diameter is large. As you bifurcate, you go to muscular arteries, and the vessel diameter is smaller and smaller. It's down to the capillaries, you're the smallest. This is pretty easy graph. It's just showing you that blood vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller down to the capillaries, and then the capillaries start fusing, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger up to the vena cava. So that's pretty simple. But what I'm going to do now is take this concept and say, okay, what's going on with pressure and resistance? Because remember, the larger the blood vessel, the lower the resistance. Okay. This is showing you the cross-sectional area of a blood vessel, of the different blood vessels. Notice that capillaries as a whole have the greatest cross-sectional area. Now, that doesn't mean one capillary. That means you sum them all. So there should be the lowest amount of resistance in the capillaries because you went from a cross-sectional area of an elastic artery way down here near, say, 200, up to this capillary, which is near 4,500 centimeters squared. So there should be little to no resistance in the capillaries because there's such a large cross-sectional diameter, or cross-sectional area in this case. So that's showing you that. This is showing you average blood pressure. Now, the blood pressure should be lowest in the capillaries, and it should be highest in the. Now, by the way, let me go back and remind you of something, because you might see that it's not lowest in the capillaries. Well, it should be. According to this graph, it should be. Yeah, but this 4,500 is all the capillaries in your body. And the fact is that only about half of these are open at any given time. Not even half. Less than half of these are open at any given time, remember? Because you have to close them down. You don't even have enough blood to fill your capillaries in your body. So if we find that the capillaries aren't the lowest blood pressure of your body, if we find that there's more pressure in the capillaries than there are in, say, the veins, well, you got to remember that that's because we close some of these capillaries down at any given time. This is showing you the average blood pressure in different blood vessels. And as you can imagine, in the aorta, it's 120. Why? Because a normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. The 120 is actually a systolic pressure. That's when you're beating. So you can see the aorta has this average pressure of 120 right there. That's probably not the mean arterial pressure of the aorta. The mean arterial pressure of the aorta is probably about 105, 110. But I'll just go with this graph because it's in front of me and I'm talking to it. And we haven't talked about mean arterial pressure yet anyway. We will. It's called MAP, or mean arterial pressure. Mean indicating the average arterial pressure. So you can see the aorta has a higher pressure. And as you go down towards the capillaries, your pressure gets lower and lower. Now, how come these capillaries aren't the lowest pressure? Well, because less than half of them are open at any given time. That's why the venules and veins and vena cava are even lower pressure than the capillaries. Now, if all the capillaries were open, they would be the lowest pressure, but not all of them are open. This is showing you the velocity of blood flow. When the blood is under high pressure, the velocity is greater. So when you have this aorta under high pressure, you have great velocity. When you have low pressure blood, like in your capillaries and your veins, you have lower velocity. Now, why is the velocity climbing as you go back towards the heart in these bigger and bigger veins like the vena cava? Well, it has to do with skeletal muscle contraction. It has to do with breathing. Now, I haven't explained this about breathing yet, but just think of your thoracic cavity. Every time you inhale, you are making the pressure inside your thoracic cavity negative. That's why you inhale. Well, that negative pressure sucks blood back into the veins of your thoracic cavity. Just think about that. Every time your chest expands and you inhale, that thoracic cavity is under a negative pressure. Those veins are also inflating in low pressure and sucking blood into them, because blood's going to go from a high pressure to a low pressure. That increases the velocity of the blood traveling through those big thoracic veins. And by the way, the vena cava enters the thoracic cavity above the diaphragm, and that's the inferior vena cava, and the superior vena cava enters the thoracic cavity right below rib 1. So in these vena cavas, when they're in the thoracic cavity, they have increased velocity of blood flow. This is a collage showing you all those relationships together. And I hope it's starting to make sense to you. It's pretty intuitive except for this right here. How can capillaries have the greatest cross-sectional area but still have higher pressure than veins, those two circled areas? And the answer to that counterintuitive question is because less than half of these are open at any given time. That's the answer. This is showing you mean arterial pressure. Please be able to calculate mean arterial pressure for me. Mean arterial pressure really drives most of our responses, our cardiodynamic and physiological responses. So it's not necessarily your blood pressure in your right brachial artery being 120 over 80. that drives a response. It's more likely to be the mean arterial pressure. And you can see the mean arterial pressure. Oh, it's about 105 or so. I think this is showing you slightly above 100. And that's in your large arteries. And as your large arteries become smaller and smaller and smaller, you can see the mean arterial pressure dropping. Well, that makes sense because the pressure drops on average anyway. But in your larger arteries, the mean arterial pressure is pretty consistent. You can see it starts dropping right about here. Quite a significant drop off. But in these larger arteries that we have access to, these superficial arteries, like the brachial artery in your arm and your radial artery in your wrist, where you might take a blood pressure and you could even measure a mean arterial pressure. You could calculate it from the blood pressure, by the way. This is you have a mean arterial pressure. The systolic pressure is when your heart is beating. The diastolic pressure is between beats when your heart is at rest. And the mean arterial pressure is your average pressure of that artery. All right. Now this is the meat of this section. This is what's happening in your capillaries. So this is where exchange occurs. Now, several things drive exchange, but the thing I want to talk about here is fluid gain and fluid loss. As my blood comes into a capillary, I have this capillary hydrostatic pressure. That's another way of saying blood pressure. That's blood pressure. All right. This blood pressure has the tendency to drive fluids and solutes out of my capillary and into my interstitial space. It drives them out. But I must not lose all of this fluid and solutes, or I would eventually have no blood. And when I say eventually, you pump your entire blood volume every minute. So it wouldn't take long for you to have no blood if I'm going to lose fluids constantly. So there must be some balance here that we're not talking about. Because yes, there's hydrostatic pressure pushing fluid and solutes out. But what's keeping it in? And this section right here is going to answer that. At my arterial end, my capillary hydrostatic pressure is 35 millimeters of mercury. But I have a lot of albumin in my blood that has an osmotic recall to this water I just lost. This albumin is called blood colloid osmotic pressure. And this albumin exerts a blood colloid osmotic pressure of 25. Okay? Well, 35 is greater than 25, so I'm losing fluid because 10 millimeters of mercury it's a positive 10 millimeters of mercury. 35 minus 25 is 10. So overall, I filter fluid out of my capillaries. But that's only at the arterial end. At the venual end, I have a capillary hydrostatic pressure of 18, and I still have the same amount of albumin, so my blood colloid osmotic pressure is 25. So my blood colloid osmotic pressure is greater than my capillary hydrostatic pressure, and I have a tendency to reabsorb fluid into my capillary. By how much? Well, 18 minus 25 is negative 7. That means my net filtration is negative 7. Now, at my arterial end, my net filtration was positive 10. So I'm pushing water out by positive 10. At my venual end, I'm pulling water in by 7. And it's a negative 7 because I'm pulling water in. Well, 10 is still bigger than 7. So overall, in this entire capillary bed, I've lost water because overall I have a net filtration pressure of 3. 10 minus 7 is 3. I lose water. Well, what that results in is a loss of 3.6 liters of fluid out of my blood per day. I couldn't possibly live that way. How do I lose almost 4 liters of fluid out of my blood a day and not have my blood dry up? And the answer is you can't. This fluid must get back to my blood. And what happens is my lymph vessels collect all this fluid from my interstitial space and they return it to my blood. They go to they dump it back into the subclavian vein And you'll learn that in the lymph chapter where the subclavian, well, you already learned where the subclavian vein is, but you'll learn where these lymph vessels, the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, are, where the lymph dumps back into the blood. So yeah, I have a net filtration of water out of my blood into my interstitial fluid, but my lymph system returns it. And this is why when you have worms that clog up your lymph systems, it leads to edematous conditions, edema, fluid building up in your tissues, called things like elephantiasis and filariasis. These are bad edematous conditions due to worms or parasites clogging up your lymph flow. And when we get to the lymph chapter, I'll show you a couple pictures of elephantiasis or filariasis. I don't know if I spelled filariasis correct right there. You might need a filariasis. I think it might be correct. All right, so that's the overall loss and gain of fluid, and the net loss yielding 3.6 liters per day, but that gets returned to my blood through the lymph system. Oh, before I play that video, you need to be able to calculate net filtration pressure. You absolutely have to be able to do what I just went through with the net filtration pressure of positive 10 at the arterial end and negative 7 at the venular end. And overall, what does that mean? You need to be able to calculate that. So you need to understand that CHP is capillary hydrostatic pressure, BCOP is blood colloid osmotic pressure. That's due to albumin. So if I change my albumin, I change blood colloid osmotic pressure. You need to be able to calculate that. By the way, let me tell you something else. Why, when you look at some of these countries that have starvation as a huge issue, why do you see kids that have these enormous bellies? They're starving to death. Why would their bellies be enormous? They don't have any albumin. They have very low albumin. Well, how could they have any albumin? They're not eating. They don't have any amino acids to make albumin. Well, without the albumin, my blood colloid osmotic pressure is very low. And all of this fluid escapes into my interstitial space. And one of the places it collects is in my peritoneal cavity. And the fluid is called acidic fluid, ascites. Ascites, A-S-C-I-T-E-S, ascites or acidic fluid. So in starving kids, you get this big buildup of acidic fluid and they have these big bellies. By the way, the reason why sometimes you see alcoholics with the same ascites or buildup of acidic fluid is because they've lost albumin. Why have they lost albumin? Because they're damaging their liver, because they're drinking so heavily for 30 years. They can't make albumin anymore, and they get ascites fluid build up. It's the same thing. And by the way, the name of the disease of starvation, of not having enough albumin, is called kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor. There's another related disease called marasmus. Marasmus and kwashiorkor are two diseases that are diseases that are explained by this net filtration pressure in the capillaries.
Capillaries are thin-walled blood vessels with an arterial and venous end. Their thin walls and narrow diameter are optimal for the exchange of fluid, gases, nutrients, and waste between blood and tissues of the body. This process is called capillary exchange. In general, fluid moves out of capillaries at their arterial ends. Most, but not all, of that fluid re-enters at their venous ends. The forces that drive fluid and its dissolved contents into and out of capillaries are net hydrostatic pressure, which is the difference between blood and interstitial fluid pressures, and oncotic pressure, which is the difference between blood and interstitial colloid osmotic pressures. Net filtration pressure is the difference between net hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure. This regulates the inward and outward movement of fluid at each end of the capillary. At the arterial end of the capillary, a positive net filtration pressure favors movement of fluid from the blood into the interstitial space. For example, the difference between a net hydrostatic pressure of 33 millimeters mercury and an oncotic pressure of 20 millimeters mercury results in a net filtration pressure of 13 millimeters mercury that forces fluid out of the capillary. The shift from filtration to reabsorption at the venous end of the capillary is due to a lower capillary blood or hydrostatic pressure. Here, the difference between a net hydrostatic pressure of 13 millimeters mercury and an oncotic pressure of 20 millimeters mercury results in a net filtration pressure of negative 7 millimeters mercury. This negative net filtration pressure forces fluid from the interstitial space back into the capillary. Approximately 90% of the fluid that leaves the blood capillary at its arterial end will re-enter at its venous end. Lymphatic capillaries capture the remaining 10% of the fluid. Fluid in the lymphatic system is eventually returned to the bloodstream. This table summarizes the forces that influence the fluid exchange at the arterial and venous ends of a capillary.
Okay, make sure you can do some of that math. It's on the test. Net hydrostatic pressure is just the difference between blood pressure and interstitial hydrostatic pressure. There is some interstitial pressure as well, and blood pressure is greater than interstitial pressure, but you have to take blood pressure minus interstitial pressure to get your net hydrostatic pressure. Oncotic pressure is the difference between the osmotic pressure in the blood and the osmotic pressure in the interstitial space. And blood has a lot of albumin, so it has more oncotic pressure than interstitial fluid, but you still have to take that into account, and you have to say the colloid osmotic pressure of the blood minus the colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial space gives you the oncotic pressure. And then net filtration pressure is simply net hydrostatic minus oncotic. That's all it is. All right, so make sure you can do that. Take another look at it.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.
The video is not different than the last one. The last one said 90% and 10%. That's the same as 9/10 and 1/10. So it's not a different statement there. And that's it. I'll see you in the next section, folks.